Karen calls 911 when I refuse to give her the keys to my house. You ever feel like life throws you into situations you never signed up for, and the only thing you can do is figure out how to keep going? That's exactly where I found myself almost 2 years ago, staring down the barrel of my late father's will. I was 28 at the time, juggling long hours at an engineering firm in Dallas and living a life that, by all accounts, seemed perfectly fine. But fine is just another word for empty, isn't it? I grew up in a small town, one of those places where everybody knows your name and what kind of pie your grandma brings to the church bake sale. My parents, Sarah and David, were the kind of couple people looked up to, hardworking, honest, and deeply in love. Mom had this way of making everyone around her feel seen. She was a nurse, which fit her nurturing nature like a glove. I can still hear her voice sometimes, gentle and soothing, calling me in for dinner or cheering me on at Little League games. Dad, on the other hand, was the strong, silent type. He wasn't much for words, but when he spoke, you listened. He worked construction most of his life, building houses and dreaming about one day owning a piece of land where he could retire and live simply. He used to talk about it when I was a kid, sitting on the porch of a small farmhouse, watching the sun set over his own land. Back then, it sounded like one of those vague ideas parents toss around to keep themselves motivated. But looking back, I think it was the one thing he truly wanted. Things changed 5 years ago. I was 25, still living in the city, trying to climb the corporate ladder when I got the call. My mom had been in a car accident on her way home from work. By the time I reached the hospital, it was already too late. Losing her felt like someone had ripped the floor out from under me. She'd been the glue that held us together, and without her, Dad and I didn't really know how to talk to each other anymore. I buried myself in work after that. It was easier than dealing with the grief, easier than facing my dad's quiet sadness. While I was pulling 12-hour days in the city, Dad sold the house I grew up in and bought the ranch he'd always dreamed about, 12 acres of rolling hills, a creek running through the back, and an old farmhouse that had seen better days. I only visited a handful of times. I told myself I was too busy, but the truth is, being around him felt like staring into a mirror I wasn't ready to face. He had lost the love of his life, and I was too scared to admit how much I do it. Then, 2 years ago, everything changed again. I was sitting at my desk when I got another call, this time from a neighbor. Dad hadn't shown up to the feed store that morning, which wasn't like him. My stomach tightened as I drove out to the ranch, every worst-case scenario running through my mind. When I finally got there, I found him in his chair on the front porch, a cup of coffee still in his hand, as if he had just dozed off. But he wasn't asleep. He was gone. Losing him felt different from losing Mom. Her death had been sudden, chaotic, full of unanswered questions. But with Dad, it was quiet. Peaceful, even. He'd spent his last years on the land he'd always wanted, and maybe in some way, that brought him peace. But it left me with a house, a ranch, and a life I had no idea what to do with. The will was simple. Everything went to me. No conditions, no complications. Just the land, the house, and whatever was inside. I thought about selling it. I even met with a realtor once, just to see my options. But standing on that porch, looking out over the hills my dad had loved so much, something in me hesitated. He had poured everything into this place. Could I really just walk away? The city had never felt like home, not really. And for the first time in years, I had nowhere else to be. So, I packed up my apartment, took a leave of absence from work, and moved into the old farmhouse my dad left behind. That was when I met Karen. She lived 2 properties over, in a big modern house that stuck out against the rural landscape like a sore thumb. She introduced herself the very first day, marching up my gravel driveway in designer boots and a perfectly pressed blouse. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, a bright, too-wide smile plastered on her face. "I was hoping I'd get to meet you before you sold this place." I frowned at that. "I'm not selling." For the briefest second, her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Oh. Well, that's surprising," she said, glancing at the house behind me like it was some kind of mistake. "I just assumed you'd want to move back to the city. This area is more suited for, people like us." That was my first clue that Karen had a very specific idea of who belonged here.